Yes. In the meantime, we have lots of drinks. Let's see if we can exhaust them before he gets back. That would be hilarious. So I'll talk for 10, 15, 20 minutes. When the food arrives, then I'll stop, and then we can kick off again. We get to talk about .NET Core today. That'll be really cool. Before we go, what are the upcoming events? What's happening in the next little bit? DevOps Days Phoenix is October 14th, is that right? 24th. October 24th. The next Give Camp is November 18th. That'll be a lot of fun. Desert Code Camp is October 18th? 14th. October 14th? I just got those two backwards. That's really cool. So if you want to go to Desert Code Camp, definitely show up at DevOps Days because those are totally different. Desert Code Camp is actually really cool. We'll get to talk about one tonight. Desert Code Camp is 200 things. We'll have 10, 15, 20 simultaneously where it's a particular topic. Or each session, rather, each hour is a particular topic given by a volunteer. So, over the last few months, we've been collecting submissions. I submitted some talks too, and then they for the most part just put them on the schedule. Everyone who submitted was able to, and that's really cool. So your commitment to a particular topic, I only need to stay with Python for an hour if that's all I want to learn. Or, that can be my jumping off point to go learn lots of stuff. So Desert Code Camp is really, really fun. What else is coming up? There's an awesome CI/CD talk last night. That was really cool. SoCal Code Camp is coming up December 2nd and 3rd in LA. That'll be really cool. I think those are all the events that I know of. Anyone else know of any other cool events? Awesome. Well, while we have the hive mind here, what are you stuck on? What would you like help with? Yep.
How about beyond just doing a .NET run and getting the flow template to work, which is pretty easy. After that, like some CRUD and some basics after that.
Oh, that'll be awesome.
And maybe some authorization or security.
Yeah. Authorization and security in .NET? .NET Core?
.NET Core.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too much for today.
That'll be fun. Let's do it. What are you stuck on? Oh, his question. Yes, I totally forgot that. My bad. We wanted to look at authorization, data access, kind of advanced scenarios inside .NET. We can get to .NET New, .NET Run, but what's after that? So that'll be the topic tonight. That'll be really fun. Awesome. Then go ahead.
Do you record this, or is it streaming? Recording.
It's recording.
Okay.
Yeah.
Post them on the meetup site?
It'll take us a bit to get the video, but it'll be on YouTube eventually. And once it lands on YouTube, it would be really nice to link it to Meetup. That would be cool. Getting all of that connected, sometimes things fall down, but we'll see where we go. Which leads me nicely to my next point. Here's the part where I say I'm definitely going to post my slides on my blog tonight. And tonight you're going to check and they're not there. You're going to come back tomorrow. You're going to come back again next week. After about a month, you're going to get tired of waiting. You're going to email me. I'm going to definitely read that email right away, and I'll respond in 3 months. And I'll say, yeah, I'm definitely going to post them tonight, and I'll never post them ever. So you can go to my blog right now. If you go to robrich.org, and you click on presentations and scroll down to what is this .NET Core thing anyway? These are the slides that we'll look at tonight. So you can view the presentation right now. You can follow along. Feel free to get ahead. Feel free to heckle me when I read the slide wrong. These slides are yours, and you can enjoy them. So who's the guy in the front of the room? This is also from my blog, robrich.org/about. Some of the things that I've done. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm a friend of Redgate. AZ GiveCamp is actually really amazing. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities who otherwise couldn't afford software services. Friday after work, we build software for them. Sunday afternoon, we deliver completed software. Sleep is caffeine provided. It's really cool. And so our annual event in March will do exactly that, start on Friday and end on Sunday. There are some who just go straight. It's awesome. But November 18th, we're doing a mini event, just a single day from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. or so, 9:30 to 5, where we're just going to work on a single charities project. And so that will actually be at Arco Sante on November 18th. That'll be really, really fun. So that's AZ GiveCamp. SQL Server source control basics. That was a lot of fun to write. Mine is chapter 8. And I was also a technical reviewer on that book as well. I was in the Gulp project on version 2 and version 3. That was a lot of fun to build. We're here at the Southeast Valley.NET user group, but I'm also associated with the Phoenix Angular meetup. One of the things that I'm particularly proud of, .NET Rocks. I replied to .NET Rocks episode. They read my comment on the air. I got a mug! Woohoo! So that's a little bit about me. And we're here to talk about .NET Core. So what is this .NET Core thing? Ooh, perfect time. Let's pause and eat some things.
We're coming in. One person help.
.NET Core. So we have .NET Core. We talked about ASP.NET vNext for a while. We talked about ASP.NET 5 for a while. All those things are the same thing. It is .NET Core. They rebranded it as .NET Core. I think that's a better name, all else being equal. It's unfortunate they did it that late, but .NET Core is actually pretty cool. So when we were originally promised this, .NET Core, we had this nice slide of all of the features that it was going to be. These are the ones that made it. Single compile works cross-platform rather. So we now have .NET on Linux, we have .NET on Mac, and so we can run .NET in all of the environments, Android and iOS as well, with Xamarin. It is completely open source, so all of .NET, it's really fun to brag that .NET is actually more open source than Java right now. That's really interesting. It's a lot lighter weight. If we think about when .NET came out, .NET came out in the realm of SOAP, and the big thing was ASMIC services. Fast forward today, and we have a whole lot of REST things, and so that's a very different world. That new lighter weight thing, if I think of a socket server, WebSocket server, where I want to do a chat application, that's a very different experience than a traditional website that I would build in the late 90s or early 2000s. So .NET Core is that reimagination of .NET in that much leaner mechanism. Let's take a break and grab some food. Welcome back, everybody. I'm glad we're adequately fed. We're going to talk about .NET Core. I already introduced myself and all of that mayhem, so we'll just jump right into .NET Core. Thanks to Isogenics for feeding us. .NET Core. I'm this guy. .NET Core. .NET Core. So I remember this ASP.NET 5 thing. I remember this ASP.NET vNext thing, and I remember the slide of all of the things apparently that was coming to Linux and open source, and so we got this kind of pitch of, you know, the next version of .NET. We think about when .NET first came out. .NET came out in 2000. Well, what was the big thing in 2000? Well, we had SOAP services. We were building monoliths. Today we have web sockets, and we have chatbots, and we have JSON. And so ultimately, .NET was kind of getting a little bulky. And so this reboot was great in kind of setting up the next 15 years of .NET. And so it took a couple of iterations, especially in the name, to get to this .NET Core. .NET Core then is kind of this reimagination of .NET. Here's some of the features that we were promised early on that we now have in .NET Core. A single compile works across. So we have .NET on Linux, we have .NET on Mac. With Xamarin, we now have .NET on Mono, or on Android and also iOS. And so pretty much anywhere you go, you can do C# and target it that way. Even took .NET Core into their TVs, which is kind of interesting. So that single compile will work everywhere. You can then compile it down into the native piece, and it's no longer now a cross-platform DLL. But you can compile and then just take that DLL and move it to the other platform, and it just works, and it's wonderful. The entirety of it is now open source, which is wonderful. You can go to GitHub/Microsoft/ASP.NET. You can view all of ASP.NET. You can also go dig into .NET Core. .NET is now more open source than Java. That's really interesting. It's a whole lot lighter weight. You know, previously, have 2 megs of mechanism to spin up a request. Now it's, you know, in the range of 2K. So of course our servers are now much, much faster, you know, without all of the things. We think what spun up when we spun up .NET, what's part of .NET? Windows Forms, WCF, GDI. All of these things got pulled in. And now in .NET Core, we don't have those dependencies. It's a complete reimagination of .NET. We removed all of that legacy baggage. We're in a world now where command line is kind of the way that we do things. We don't need to do it from the command line, but all of the things that we can do from the command line too. We can scaffold projects, we can build, we can publish NuGet packages, and all of that is through the .NET CLI. We'll see some of that today. That'll be really fun. Bin deployable framework is really interesting. You know, if I find a bug in the .NET framework and I just can't wait for them to do a new thing, I can fork their Git repository. I can build my own framework, and I can deploy that framework and get my app to run on that. Alternatively, if I can't convince IT to install .NET Core SDK on, or .NET Core runtime on a machine, I can just take the entire .NET Core pieces that I'm using and ship that with my application. Obviously, my bin folder will be bigger, but I'm running without anything installed on that machine, and that's really cool. What's really cool is dependency injection. In all the places where you have interesting statics or interesting weird pieces, now dependency injection is just baked in. It's lighter, leaner than some of the traditional IOC containers, and you can definitely rig IOC to .NET Core's system. But now that just makes testing a breeze because I can just inject mock dependencies into .NET's IOC container, and it just works. Any questions so far about what we've seen in .NET? Yep.
Do you have a preference on the bin deployable?
Do I have a preference on bin deployable? All else being equal, if I'm going to run more than one thing on a certain machine, I would rather have the framework installed there at one time. Because at that point, I only need to install the pieces of my application that are specific to my application. I don't need to install all of .NET. Anything bigger than that, if I'm running only one thing on a box, or if I'm running a thing inside of a Docker container, then bin deployable starts to be intriguing.
I was going to suggest that, similar to what you just said, that in cloud environments, it tends to work better when you're deploying everything.
Yeah. In cloud environments, it does. Cloud environments make bin deployable assemblies really interesting. That was a great question. Any other questions so far? So they promised us more than that. What didn't we get? Well, we didn't get this. One of the really cool demos early on was this in-memory compilation thing. It was really fun. I'm grabbing a source, building this DLL, I'm writing it to disk. Then I'm spinning up a server that's reading that file on disk. They had this really nice mechanism that was in memory, shipping that assembly through a WebSocket to the web server, and that was amazing, and it is gone. Sorry. Project.json was a really elegant way where we could write our own project file. It was just a JSON file. Everything in there made a lot of sense. We've moved to XML. They were very diligent to take the things that they learned from project.json and apply it to the csproj file. And we'll see a csproj file in a little bit that, it's a whole lot shorter, but it's still XML. There's no GUIDs in it. So if you're really adventurous, you could write it. We write XML all the time. It's called HTML. But yeah, we don't have a project.json anymore. The web config came. In a self-hosted environment, we don't need a web config. But as we're setting the file inside of IIS's purview, that web config is able to kind of shim those pieces together. So yeah, web config came back. And though technically everything is still in small packages, they've created this meta package, Microsoft.ASP.NET. That includes everything. But on the upside, we now have tree shaking. As we do that compilation step, they go figure out which pieces of the .NET framework we're using and only pull in those NuGet packages that we actually need. We only have one reference, but we still have small deployment targets. That came in .NET Core 2. So we didn't get all of these things, but I still think we got a pretty cool setup. .NET Core is much, much faster, much leaner, and I think we've now set ourselves up for a great next generation of .NET. So .NET Core, .NET Core, .NET Standard. So I've heard of .NET Framework, and I've heard of .NET Core. Is there now a third .NET? Is there .NET Standard? .NET Standard is an API. Here's the problem at hand. I have .NET. Here's the full .NET framework. I have the common language runtime. I have framework libraries. I'll have a base class library, and then I build my app on top of this stack. There's the .NET framework, which is great right up until we need it to run somewhere else, like the Compact framework, or like Silverlight, or SQL CLR, or Mono, or WCF, client profile. All of these became forks of .NET. So I end up with 20 or 30 of these entire stacks. And they rev themselves at different cadences, and so I end up with, if I want to target this version of the framework, I'm only targeting this version. I need to rebuild to get onto Mono or to get onto Compact framework. So we created this, portable class libraries, which was awesome. I start up, I get to pick all the things that I want. I want to go to .NET Framework, I want to go to Windows, I want to go to Windows Phone, I want to go to Silverlight, and I could pick Xbox, and I end up with the subset of .NET that happens to run in all those places. So basically, I get string. Woohoo! String. So this was great, but I still need to recompile to hit a new version of .NET. Can we do better? Can we create kind of this line in the sand that says, if your framework is this high, then everything that is there? That is .NET Standard. It is for identifying levels of compatibility .NET implementations. .NET Standard is not it is rather an API that all the .NET frameworks then meet. So the portable class library is interesting, but I must rebuild every time I go to interesting places. Instead, we want this kind of model where we have the core CLR, we have the native runtime, we have that runtime application layer, we have the unified base class libraries, and then we have a bunch of these little .NET frameworks that sit on top of that. So when we look at .NET Standard, we look at .NET Standard versions, and there's this wonderfully convoluted chart, but I like to look at it like this. Here's .NET Standard 1.0. It has this much API service. 0.1, it has this much API surface. Here's some more APIs. Here's some more APIs. And so as I get bigger, I end up with more stuff. If my library only happens to be this big, that means I only fit within the 1.0 sphere. Ideally, when I'm targeting this, I want to find the lowest level that I can be comfortable with that has enough APIs for my needs so that it can run in as many places as I want. Well, actually, it doesn't quite look like this. It kind of looks like this because these were pretty linear growths. And then 2.0 is like, all of this times 2.5. They went from 7,000 APIs to 32,000 APIs. That's kind of cool. And actually, technically did this, but then they undid that. They're like, nope, nothing to see here. So yeah, 1.6 was bigger for it, then they kind of squished it back into place to make 2.0 always a concentric circle. So then the next real question is, well, how do we deprecate things? How do we remove things? The answer that I got when I asked that question was, well, we marked things obsolete in the .NET framework, but we never actually ever removed them. So we're just going to remove the obsolete. Every .NET framework, every .NET Standard version then will be, by definition, be a superset of the previous version. So in theory, if it runs on .NET Standard 1.3, it will also run on .NET Standard 1.4, 1.5. It will always be a superset of features. So if I have a .NET Standard 1.4 library, I can run it on 1.5 or 2.0. Anyone remember .NET Framework 1.1? 1.0? I suspect in a year we'll go, so 2.0 is the center of the circle, and what does 3.0 look like? So here's that wonderfully, this is really cool. So I have the .NET Standard that is kind of the base libraries, the normal things that I'm looking at. And then I have these other frameworks that don't need to be in every runtime. I don't need iOS and Android compatibility on my web server. I don't need WinForms on my Android app. I don't need ASP.NET to run on my IoT device. These frameworks will live outside of .NET. Will be additional features that I can opt into. So if I want to run on .NET Standard 1.3, I can also include this other library. If I want to run on .NET Standard 1.5, I can also bring in this. I'm not excluded from using these other environments, but these feature sets are not part of .NET Standard. .NET Standard is that API that says you must be this tall to be a .NET framework. So this is that wonderfully confusing table that we all see. And now that we've seen those concentric circles, perhaps this makes more sense. If I'm in a .NET standard version of 1.0, I can run all the things. Everything that is a .NET framework will run here. When I get to 1.1, I lose Windows Phone Silverlight support. When I get to 1.3, I lose Windows 8.1 port. The farther that I go up, the higher the number is. Here's where they did that little blip. They said, well, it's going to be 4.62, and then they changed their mind. It's .NET Framework 4.6.1 is 1.5 compatible. And then moving up, here's where I get Xamarin iOS. In 1.6, it's Xamarin iOS 10.0. Xamarin Mac is 3.0. Xamarin Android is 7.0. For .NET Standard 2.0, then it's Xamarin 10.14, 3.8, 7.5. The interesting thing is because they kind of built .NET Standard and .NET Core at the same time, these numbers kind of line up real well. .NET Core 2.0 is part of .NET Standard 2.0. I find this interesting. .NET Core 1 is actually .NET Standard 1.6. Version of .NET Standard and .NET Core do I need to be on? If you're only targeting one runtime, you only want to run on the server, or you only want to run on iOS, then you can forget .NET Standard completely, and you can just reference .NET Core and the frameworks that you need. If you want to make kind of a universal library that is consumable by everything, that's when you will create that library as a .NET Standard library, and then consume it with all of the other things. Any questions on .NET Standard?
How much overhead is experienced between 1 and 2, seeing that you have to support all of those different applications, Windows, Windows Phone?
That's a good question. So how big is .NET Standard 2.0 if it's doing all of these things? Actually, not that way. This is a .NET framework. This is a .NET framework. This is a .NET framework. And so it's just creating MSIL that is, good enough for all of them. At runtime, it kind of, they call it the big lie. I compile to .NET Standard, it means nothing. And then once I stick my, it goes, oh, I know how to implement that. And then I bleed into the runtime that I'm using. So it's not like I'm installing all of these frameworks when I install .NET Framework or .NET Core 2.0. I'm only installing this line when I get to 2.0. Yeah, 2.0 is definitely bigger than 1.6. I haven't noticed a difference. It's not substantially so. Did that answer your question? Not at all. Yeah?
So reading this chart, just to make sure I'm understanding the way it lines up. If I wanted to write something today that could run in Universal Windows Platform and on .NET Framework on an IIS server or in a .NET Core thing, I would be using .NET Platform Standard 1.6 because it could run on the 1.0 core runtime, the 4.6.1 on IIS, or on the Universal Windows Platform for 10. If I went to .NET Standard 2.0, I could start running on a 2.0 core server, but I would lose the ability to use that library in a Universal Windows Platform app today.
Yes, exactly. If I want to hit Universal Windows, and I want to hit .NET Core, and I want to hit .NET Framework on IIS, then I go to that spot where, that least piece. So I'd be right here, Universal Windows Platform 10, .NET Framework 4.61, and .NET Core 1.0. That, .NET Standard 1.4 row will give me compatibility with all of those things.
Okay.
As soon as I step into 1.5, I lose Windows Universal Windows Platform until whatever they're building right here.
Okay.
That was great. I like that. Any other questions so far?
based off your explanation of universal, the arrows don't mean it carries forward?
Yes, based on this definition, this arrow means that this version is compatible with those .NET Standard versions as well. So if I build a library in Windows Universal Platform 10.0, it's a 1.4 one, but it's also 1.3 and 1.2 compatible as well. So I can consume a 1.2 compatible DLL. I can't consume a 1.5 compatible DLL, but I could consume a prior one.
1.5 and 1.6 won't support universal DNS.
Exactly. If I want UWP, I stop at 1.4 until whatever this thing comes up.
Oh, that's confusing.
Yeah.
Feels like there should have been some X's in there, not arrows.
Yeah. And in later versions of this, I've seen them not as arrows, just as numbers. You know, this is 1.0, and this is 1.0, and this is 1.0, and this is 1.0, and after a while, it's like, well, what's the number there? This is actually that chart that I pulled it from, the latest version of it. And yeah, they have numbers instead of letters. So if I install .NET Framework 4.6, I can run .NET 1.0 apps, 1.1 apps, 1.2 apps, 1.3 apps. But I can't run 1.4 apps. I have to install .NET Framework 4.6.1 to be able to do that. To run .NET Standard 2 things, I need 4.6.1. The theory was, you know, could we make this 4.6.2 and could we make this 4.7? And in the end, they chose not to. So .NET Standard .NET Standard is not a compile target. It's an API. And I love this. David Fowler built this. And sometimes this is like the thing that lights it up. Here is .NET Standard 1.0. And it does, you know, these things. Here's .NET Standard 1.1. It descends from .NET Standard 1.0, and it also does these things. .NET Standard 1.2 implement .NET Standard 1.1 also does these things. So this just is awesome. You know, ultimately, those aren't actual methods, but this is a cool way to visualize the features that come into play in each .NET Framework version. David Fowler's just is really cool. So .NET Standard is not a runtime. It is that abstract API. If I want to create a project for .NET Standard, I just say here in my CS proj, the target framework is .NET Standard 2 or .NET Standard 1.6. If I have a .NET Core project, then I'll say, hey, my target framework is .NET Core App 2.0. And then if it's a regular .NET framework, I don't have this really cool, nifty, lighter CS proj experience. I have the target framework version 4.6.1. So .NET Standard is fun. Let's dig into the .NET CLI. What's cool about the .NET CLI, always before we had to, you know, launch Visual Studio and do interesting things. Now here in the .NET CLI, it's actually .NET, which is kind of funny. .NET, .exe, .sh. Actually, I bet it's .so1. We have various projects. .NET New will create a new project. .NET Restore will restore NuGet packages. .NET Build, .NET Publish, .NET Run. And so as I'm running these things, if it's in a folder that has a CS proj, alternatively I can hand it a CS proj or a solution file, it'll do the things that it needs to do to get those things running. Publish, run, test. I rig up my test runner to know what .NET test is, and I just say, hey, .NET test, and away we go. You know how you have to go figure out all these weird MS build commands to get your build server to do interesting things? Now your build server is cake. .NET Restore, .NET Build, .NET Test, .NET Pack as a NuGet package. .NET Pack as a NuGet package. This is really cool. So before NuGet was kind of this bolt-on to .NET, now it's an integral part of the process. And so even in the .NET CLI, I can package my project as a NuGet package straight away. All the content that I need is in the project file. So project templates, there's a bunch of them. The Visual Studio project templates are open source, which is really cool. Steve Sanderson did this, and it is amazing. He created some templates that use SPA frameworks behind the scenes, and it will do some server-side rendering through JavaScript services, and it just kind of shells out into Node, which is really fun. And then this is actually really, really cool. The available templates for .NET New. You can say .NET New I install, and this template pack, that's Steve Sanderson's one, and then away they go. You can just create a bunch of them. You can publish a NuGet package that is your .NET New projects, and they actually like kind of a NuGet.org feel that is various template packs for how to create new things. So creating new things, let's dig into the .NET CLI and let's go build some new stuff. We won't get anything fancy, but I've installed a few things. So when I say .NET, let's get a CLI that'll work. .NET New. Here's the template packs that I've installed. I've installed ASP.NET Core web app. I've installed some Angular and React things, web API. I'm just going to go simple in this case, and I'm going to say .NET New. Actually, I just have an empty folder here that I started out. .NET New. Where is it? Console. And if I want, I can specify the version of the framework. But I'll just say .NET New Console, and it'll create this new console application. Firing up that project, here's that console application. Here's the program.cs that I just generated. So I could pop open this, and right now it says hello world. Let's say, actually, let's build it that way. .NET Restore. That'll pull in all of the NuGet packages that I need. .NET Run. And there is hello world. There we go, hello world. And let's say hello Chandler. .NET build. .NET Run. Now that says hello Chandler. I could run it from the command line, and this is definitely fun. We may choose to upgrade into Visual Studio, and that's definitely a possibility as well. Before we do that, let's just pop open this this CS proj file. That's it. It's an output type of exe. Here's that target framework. It's saying it's a .NET Core app. We don't need to list files anymore. We don't need to list all the GUIDs that we had. In theory, we could write this ourselves if we wanted to. Mkdir MVC app, .NET new MVC. Oh, I'm outside of the folder. That's going to do bad things. .NET new MVC, and this will scaffold out an MVC web where I'll have. If I wanted to, I could fire up Rider, the C# IDE from JetBrains, or I could fire up Visual Studio Code, and I could completely build this app outside of outside. Well, that CLI is interesting, but I may instead want to upgrade to Visual Studio. And that's definitely a path as well. Let's dig into a little bit of ASP.NET Core, and then we'll fire up Visual Studio, and we'll see that same experience. Any questions thus far on the .NET CLI?
Get it on your build server, do you just install the build tools? Or do you get it on there?
How do you get the .NET Core onto your build server?
CLI.
The .NET CLI on your build server? I've always just grabbed the .NET SDK in .NET. I think that web address is awesome. I just hit download, and it will point me at the SDK for the version that I'm looking for. So if I have Windows x64, here's an EXE. Mac OS, here's a PKG. And so I just go download that, and that'll get me through the day. .NET standard support for Visual Studio 2015 is the only MSI, which I think is pretty cool. So that's how I'll get .NET onto my box. That was a great question. Any other questions so far? That stage is a lot of fun.
The new bash subsystem, would you be running the Windows version of it on there, or can you install the Linux version of it and run it through bash?
That's a good question. In the bash, in the Linux subsystem for Windows, am I running the Windows version of the .NET command line, or am I running the Linux version of the .NET command line? I'm running the Linux version of the .NET command line. Once I'm inside bash for Windows, I'm inside Linux. You know, to all intents and purposes, hostname, you know, ifconfig, it's a Linux machine. apt-get.net. That is so fun. apt-get.net. It's like, we have .NET on Linux. This is so cool. So ASP.NET. We have the .NET framework, and we have ASP.NET. We have .NET Core, and we have ASP.NET Core. ASP.NET Core sits on top of .NET Standard and allows us all of the normal things. Controllers, Razor, action filters, web API, all the things that we're used to in ASP.NET are here. They ported ASP.NET onto .NET Standard, but they ported all of the concepts too. Probably, if you're bringing over a pretty standard site, the only thing you're going to do is change the using statements up of those. The startup mechanism is a little bit different, but the controllers and the views, that's exactly the same. Everything that we know and love is here.
Question on that.
Yep.
It said Razor.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, I know there was the MVC version that was like, had more like an angular-looking markup instead of the Razor. Is it that you just have a choice between those view engines, or did they walk back?
Good call. There's Razor here, and that gives us Razor helpers. But there's this new, you know, kind of angular-y kind of, you know, syntax on top of tags. Do I have to pick one or the other? That syntax is built into Razor now. Okay. And so that it's called tag helpers. That gives us the ability to append to tags. So, you know, if I wanted to form an A tag, previously in Razor, I had to do @HTML.actionLink, and then I'm passing in these things. Well, how do I set a CSS class? Well, I create this new object, and then I create a class property on my object. Class is a reserved word in C#. So, how do I get more HTML goodness? With tag helpers, I'm just creating a tag, and I just happen to have keywords that the server knows how to render inside Razor to turn those into tags that do interesting things. Angular does that really well as well. Kind of binding to attributes in the code to do interesting things. Now, Razor's going to run server side. Angular's going to run client side. But I can put both Angular and Razor tags on the DOM attribute. Razor ones will get server side. What gets shipped down to the wire has those resolved into regular HTML. And then the Angular tags just pick up client side and need to. Banana goes in the box. Yes, good call. Web forms is not in there. So if we have web forms, yeah, web forms doesn't run on .NET. If we look at that, web forms is .NET Framework. ASP.NET is web forms. Web forms is ASP.NET. They actually tried a couple of times to separate web forms out. It wasn't happening. I could see web forms coming back. If you've ever played with Razor pages, new in .NET, ASP.NET Core 2.0, it's kind of moving in that direction. So we may see web forms come back. But right now, there is no web forms here. I can't do the angle bracket % equals things in here. So part of ASP.NET is these new things. We talked about tag helpers, which is amazing. We also have Bower and NPM support. So all of these JavaScript package managers. The interesting thing about NuGet is it's great for server-side packages. It's great for things where I can then recursively crawl through that chain and grab those extra DLLs. But for things that I want to run out of a single directory, I can't nest those dependencies. So it turns out JavaScript has kind of solved that with Bower and NPM. We just now have tooling within Visual Studio to be able to use the industry standard JavaScript tools to accomplish the JavaScript tasks that we have. Bower and NPM is really cool. Web API was kind of built after MVC, and it was this nice play-alike kind of thing. You remember how you had controllers and API controllers, and you had action filters, and you had HTTP action filters, and you had... They're all now the same thing. All of the features that we had in Web API are now rolled in. Part of the biggest one there is self-hosted. In Web API, you could self-host an app. Just start up a console app, get it to launch a web server, and away you go. And that is exactly the way ASP.NET Core works. I am creating a program with a static void main that says, go launch my web server. And if I put that app inside the context of IIS, then I have this reverse proxy mechanism where IIS just reverse proxies into my console app. IIS will still manage the lifetime and make sure the process is restarted and running and all of that kind of thing. But my app is a separate process, IIS. Yes, welcome back to CGI. Everything old is new again. Can't wait until Fortran is on this list. So it's not quite Owen, but it's that metaphor. We have this very clean separation between server and web framework. What Owen did really well is kind of separate IIS from ASP.NET. And IIS is still a great server. So is Nginx. So is Apache. And now because I have this reverse proxy mechanism into my website, into my console app, I can use Nginx and Apache and whatever framework I want to be able to launch my app. These are the new features that we got in ASP.NET Core. Because we can move fast, because we're not bound by, SOAP and WSDL and kind of things, we can get these kinds of things really fast. So what didn't make it? Oh, so we got these features as well, just because ASP.NET is built on .NET Standard. .NET Standard If we use .NET Core, we get that cross-platform mechanism. We can run on Nano Server, which is much smaller for building Docker containers. We have this really fast startup, and we can use bin deployable dependencies if we want to as well. Because ASP.NET Core is built on top of .NET Standard, not .NET Core, if we use .NET Core, we get these features. If we use the full .NET framework, we can run just fine as well. ASP.NET Core is not bound to .NET Core. ASP.NET Core is bound to .NET Standard. Did that make sense? Yes. Microsoft is great at naming stuff. Isn't that cool? My favorite was the ASP.NET Ajax library 1.0 for ASP.NET 3.5 beta. That was like the coolest name ever. So what didn't we get? What isn't in .NET, ASP.NET Core that was in ASP.NET? Web forms. Web forms. If ever we're using HTTP context.current, that's not in this. The presumption is if I need a handle on the request or the response, there in that controller I have access. I can pass those in to all the places. Yeah. HTTP context.current was really cool, but HTTP context.current is not injectable. So DI, I would rather have DI than HTTP context.current. SignalR is awesome, and they want to bring it back. It's coming soon. It's also on GitHub, so if you want it faster, go make it so. But they're also going to take a look at SignalR and kind of make it a more generic pipe, more so than a specific browser implementation. The original SignalR kind of competed with Socket.io. This one will kind of solve WCF-like concerns, and I think that's actually much more interesting. At the point where SignalR can be, the MQTT hub for IoT devices, that could be really interesting.
So WCF?
There is no WCF in .NET Core. Yes, that's sad. May it die. I actually went Googling for WCF on .NET Core, and somebody has created a .NET Core NuGet package that has a very WCF-like interface. You have operation context, and you have binding context, and all the things that you do, and it's just a middleware inside ASP.NET. So if you're really, really stuck on WCF, good luck with that. Great question, thank you. Any other questions on ASP.NET? So ASP.NET, let's dig into ASP.NET. I do not have Visual Studio running, so I'm going to fire up Visual Studio. I've chosen to launch it in administrator mode. Visual Studio 2017 is just nice. All of the things that, it's just leaner and more elegant, and I was actually in an argument the other day where they said, you don't need ReSharper anymore. Visual Studio can do that for you now. I kind of want to take them up on that. I kind of want to turn off ReSharper for a minute and see if I can live without it.
Not without the refactoring tools library, but there are some free refactoring tools libraries out there that make it almost better in some way.
Yeah, I'm not there yet either. Here's ReSharper. So .NET Core, .NET Standard, .NET all of the things, I just want to live in Visual Studio. Let me go file new project. I'm going to choose an ASP.NET Core web application. As with any demo, it must be called Web Application 1, apparently. I'm presented with a similar thing. Do I want a web application or a web API? I can choose the version of .NET Framework, of .NET Core that I would like to use, And once I flip to .NET Core, then it lights up some other interesting things, which is kind of fun. Steve Sanderson is awesome, by the way. So I'll choose web application. I can come in here to authentication mechanism. Right now it's set to no authentication. But like in previous things, I can turn it on to individual user accounts or work accounts. That's kind of fun. Can I do Windows authentication? All of those options just do what they do. Store user accounts in app. That bake in that entity framework piece, which is really cool. I'm going to choose no authentication. Here's my web application. That file new experience. I have my controllers. I have my views. I have Visual Studio booting up. Here's my models. Here's my views. This is what I'm at home. ASP.NET Core is not foreign or weird or different. It's based on a gentler, faster foundation. But my same workflow will work just fine here too. Now it's restoring my NuGet packages at the moment. If I build, will it do that faster? Nope, it will start to pull in those. So we were talking about tag helpers. And I don't think I have any tag helpers in this project. That's a bummer. Well, I do have some. Here in the layout page, I want to link to each of my pages, and I want to be able to say, well, I have this, MVC-like thing. I want to just be able to specify the controller and the action, and so I don't want to hard code this URL. I want to be able to, get it to figure it out. So I have ASP-area equals quote quote. ASP-controller equals home, ASP-action equals index. And as that Razor page is rendered, that will turn into an href equals whatever. But when I want to style this, I want to say class equals oh, that's cool. Class equals btn default. Now I don't have to invent this mechanism of how do I set that property into place. All of the normal HTML attributes just work. So if I had a form, and I'll go invent a form. Input type equals text, placeholder equals enter text here. All of the normal tags just work, but then I can say ASP model equals model property. And I don't have a model property in here. But you notice how these tags turn purple when Razor notices that it can help here? So I can get this nice visual indication that these will be handled server-side. I'm going to pull that out so I don't get confused. So under the hood, the plumbing of how this works is actually really interesting. Here's program.cs. Here's my static void main. This is a console app with a static void main. That is really cool. Static void main says build web host, which is this thing. And web host says create default web builder, and then use this startup class, and then build. You know, this constructor pattern where it kind of assembles all of the pieces associated with firing up my web server. This startup project, this will replace global ASAX. It'll replace the app start folder. You may have a startup.cs in your .NET Framework project. And this is that magic that gets MVC going. It's broken into 3 parts. The constructor that, you know, kind of initializes everything. In this case, the constructor is grabbing configuration out of my appsettings.json file. Configure services that kind of lights up all the things, populates the DI container. Its goal is to kind of set things up. It doesn't actually instantiate anything, but it sets up all the pieces to work. So in this case, I'm going to add MVC. Now I have all the MVC things in my DI container to be able to do interesting things. And then the third piece is this configure method. That's where I actually light up all of my things. Here in this configure method, we're creating a chain of handlers, chain of functions that handle a request in interesting ways. We'll call these functions middleware, things that stand in the middle of our request. Each middleware can choose to handle the request, answering it in an interesting way. It can choose to append things onto the request or response. You know, maybe it's reading or writing headers. Or it can choose to do nothing. Each of these middlewares can then opt into that piece, and if it has an answer, it will just return that answer. Or it can say, hey, I'm not done yet. Let me pass the request on to the next piece of middleware. So in this case, I'm creating my set of middleware to handle my requests. I'm going to say, hey, if it's the development environment, let me use that browser link page. I want to have a nice detailed exception message page. Or if I'm not in development, I want to use the regular exception handler. I want to use, you know, /home/error. It will use this error page. I'll use static files so that I can host regular images and static content, and then I'll light up MVC. The order that I set these in place is the order that they'll get access to that request. And whenever somebody answers and says, I've got the answer, it will stop calling the rest of them and just exit right out. So if I have a static file and I have a route that happen to have the exact same name, in this case, I will use the static file. If I wanted to use the route instead, I can move this piece right here, and now MVC gets first crack at it. So static files are an interesting piece. Static files are the things that don't compile. And one of the concerns with .NET, the way it is today, is that I'm kind of intermingling my compiled and non-compiled files. So is it possible that someone could get a hold of my site and do malicious things just by uploading a dynamic file? All my dynamic files live out here. All of my static files live inside this www root folder. In Node, we call it the public folder. So here's my CSS, my images, my JavaScript, my libraries that I got out of Bower. And all of these live inside this www root folder. When I say use static files, that's the folder that I'm hosting. So it's not possible for them to get at my appsettings.json or my bower.json or my bundle config. So how do I know if I'm in development or not? Here in app settings, I can choose to toggle that. But also here in the properties, I can define my environment, and I am completely missing it. Debug. There it is, ASP.NET Core _ environment. This environment variable says I'm in development. Alternatively, I flip it into production, and now I hit the other side of that. So here inside Visual Studio, I'm just going to push play, do all the normal things, and that's going to light up the application. For the most part, I'm in .NET Core. or .NET Framework, I've noticed my experience is pretty much the same. I'm still building controllers, I'm still building views, I'm still doing interesting things. It's just that underlying plumbing that I notice is different, but the majority of the time, I don't see that at all. I think moving from .NET Framework to .NET Core for new projects really, really makes sense. Wow, I really screwed up that header by adding the button there. Any questions on ASP.NET inside Visual Studio? Yes, my configuration file is the app-settings.json file.
So, how do you handle like different environments? What you would have done with XML transformations?
How do I do XML transformations in this JSON world? Good call. Right here, I have an app-settings.json, but I also have an app-settings.development.json. And Visual Studio, based on this environment variable, will automatically trigger up the right thing to do. But I can also, if I want to get really explicit, here in my startup.cs, I can start to define that. This iConfiguration kind of gives me access to, do I want to dig into the environment-specific ones or do I want the generic ones? And they kind of layer themselves nicely as well.
So there's some other like JSON transformation process that
Yeah.
and it still works with the configuration management stuff at the top where it says debug.
Yes, so how does it learn whether it's debug or production? That environment variable here in the, I just...
And then at the very top, underneath team.
Under team,
At the
right here. Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll flip back and forth between debug and release, which is pretty cool. Release being a little bit more optimized. Debug, kind of leaves the symbols in. Yeah, good call. So that was less about configuration. Right. It's XML. But it'll still do those same transforms and interesting things of layering in the settings. So at the end of the day, I just say, go get the settings. And it knows that it's done that layering process to get me the right setting.
Right, so this brings up the thing. Does that mean that, so for like different kinds of apps, like console apps versus web apps and so on, they're all app settings now?
So how would I configure settings in a console app or in a Windows app? Ultimately, that depends on the platform. I really like this. Is the file called app settings? I don't believe so. I believe app-settings.json is an ASP.NET convention, but I haven't dug too deep.
You know how in regular .NET framework there's app configs and web
Yeah.
configs and
App configs and web configs and
app configs need slow cheetah.
yeah.
I was wondering maybe they finally standardized that.
I would hope so. I would hope that they've standardized that. I don't know. I agree. We've had this wonderful configuration management mechanism in ASP.NET for a good long time. And in regular WPF apps and console apps, we haven't had that same level of configuration support. From what I understand, new in .NET Core 2, this iConfiguration is injected into the DI container all the time. So I would presume that an app-settings.json would just get picked up. I now want to go do that experiment and blog about that, because that'll be really fun.
How do you do secret management? In full core, you just say database file equals this for this section. Pull everything out in a different file. What do you do in this case?
Good call. How do I manage secrets in this environment? Because I have all of these app-settings.jsons, but now how do I get this out of source control? How do I get my secrets kind of managed in an interesting way? If I come in here to my project and I say manage user secrets, it will set a key, a GUID, into my project, and it will open up this secrets.json file, which, if I mouse over it, it'll show me the path. App data / roaming / Microsoft / definitely not in the source control path for my application / user secrets / that big GUID. And automatically, as my app spins up inside Visual Studio, it will layer that setting file in as well. So anything that I want out of source control, I can put in user secrets.
So if I'm going to be on your project, how do I get the secrets JSON in the right spot? It look like a little nasty GUID in that path.
So that's all fine and good. You committed your user secrets thing, and you did. How do I get that on my box? I right-click Web Application, and I say Manage User Secrets, and it puts it in my path. And so based on that GUID that it marks there, it just knows that that's the GUID for this application. And it will go look inside whoever's running this box / that big long path to get at it. Here in my project file, oh, that's not where I put it. Let's go this way. Open folder. Here inside my CS proj, it just says that's the GUID. So as you open up user secrets after I check in this thing, it'll look for that file in your app settings thing. And if you don't have a file, it'll go, OK, I don't have any secrets. So how do we know what keys to put in there? Yeah.
It's a different story.
Slack me, and I'll tell you what values I put there. Yeah, that's a little bit weird. I would suggest we create a usersecrets.example.json file within the project and check that in with here's the contact info of the people that you asked the secrets for. Here's the keys that you should have in your file, or document it in the way that makes sense for you.
For things that you're putting in there, when you're going to go deploy it to the environments, then is it okay? I know that, like in Windows, I'm assuming since it's user secrets, you're going to be saying, oh, go look at the secrets for this domain account with this GUID. But if this is cross-platform, like Linux isn't going to work the same way as Mac is going to work the same way as. So how does the secrets translate from a development time activity to a server?
Yeah, good question. How does this secrets transform into a runtime, a deployment strategy? This is great for development. Secrets aren't in production in this way. What's cool is it's layering in environment variables, it's layering in all of the config files, and it's figuring out what it needs to do. At that point, in production, where I usually put secrets is in environment variables. So it's going to go grab those environment variables too and layer them into the configuration. So I'll create environment variables for the interesting things that I need associated with my runtime environment, and just let my application suck those in as it needs it. Whether the configuration came from the app settings file or from the user secrets file or from environment variables, by the time I get at it, what I'm after is I'm after this iConfiguration object, and I just say, hey, iConfiguration, go get me the setting. And based on how I chose to layer those things in, it will go check the environment variables, and it'll go check the environment-specific JSON file, and it'll go check the app settings file, and if I'm in Visual Studio, it'll go check the user secrets file. And it'll layer those in, and it will just hand me the result of all of those. So from an application coding perspective, I don't need to care where that setting was stored. I need only know that it was stored in the place that it was appropriate to that environment. I actually liked it a little bit better. They removed it because nobody ever did it. But it very clearly outlined, I'm going to go grab app settings, and then I'm going to go grab appsettings.env.json, and then I'm going to go layer in environment variables after that. And now it just says, iConfiguration. Thanks. I love that they removed the boilerplate, but I kind of liked seeing those internals.
When you created the project, you had other things like Angular and React. Did you have to install anything extra
Good call. When I said file new project, I had an Angular project, I had a React project. I didn't need to install anything for those two. On the command line, I did choose to install extra templates, and that's why my list was so long. On the command line, you only have MVC and console app, and I think unit test project.
It seems like lots of the big client-side libraries now have their own command lines, basically.
So Angular has the Angular CLI, and React has nothing. And Vue has Vue's CLI, and probably I'll be leveraging these CLIs to be able to generate that portion of the project. Why would I want to choose then the Angular template built into ASP.NET? Because I get that ahead of time compilation through JavaScript services built into .NET. I get that hot module reloading built into .NET. If that's important to me, then that's great. If not, if my Angular app really does sit on a separate domain and just happens to call into my API, then that's perfect. I can exclude the Razor engine. I can choose just to hit a web API project. There's no difference internally, but now my controllers will just return JSON, and that works just as well. The Angular CLI and the Vue CLI may be more powerful for the situation that I'm going for.
The web API stuff, do you still get the documentation upset like you used to?
For web API, do I still get the documentation? I don't believe so. Every time that I've needed that documentation, they've pointed me towards Swashbuckle, which is a NuGet package that automatically crawls your controller and generates Swagger API documentation. Swagger is not the only standard in town, but it's become the more or less de facto standard for documenting REST APIs. And so by using Swashbuckle, this open source community package, we kind of get that thing out of the box. We don't get the Microsoft brand docs, and we just get regular Swagger docs. Include swashbuckle.ui, and you get Swagger UI, and now you have this really, really nice test page too. It's really cool. Any other questions so far? That was a big stick that just walked in the door. So ASP.NET Core. In the box, we also get Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework Core, like ASP.NET Core and like .NET Core, is a reimagination of Entity Framework, a port. At one point, it was called Entity Framework 7. It's now called Entity Framework Core to really emphasize that it is completely different. Like ASP.NET Core, it is a port of all of the modern concepts. Much better defaults out of the box, which is wonderful. Supports much more database types. Entity Framework is no longer considered relational databases, which is really cool. As they were developing it, they actually kept up to date with a Redis provider. As they got to 1.0, they set that aside because they didn't want to support it forever. But yeah, non-relational databases out of Entity Framework. That's really cool. And Entity Framework migrations is baked into the piece as well. We are using code first, classes to produce it. It's not that you have to create the classes and use that to generate the database, but rather we don't have an EDMX. We don't have a designer. If you're really married to that EDMX and that connection string that is heinously long and the XML that has user-specific changes right along those changes that you want to version, yeah, good luck with that. But Entity Framework Core is a much leaner take on this. Yep.
Performance. Have they improved on the performance, the speed?
Yes, Entity Framework Core is much, much faster than Entity Framework. How much? This much?
Yeah,
This much?
right. Yeah, it sounds true.
Yeah. There. Entity Framework Core 1.0 came out with .NET Core 1.0, and Entity Framework Core 2.0 came out with .NET Core 2.0 just a few weeks ago. There have been some benchmarks, and I don't have them in my head, but they were benchmarking against micro frameworks, which is kind of cool. You know, that's a really elegant place to be.
I knew of any frameworks back when whenever it was, and this went to Dapper, and I've used it ever since, but curious, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Dapper is a great solution. And to that end, if you don't like Entity Framework, there's others. There's Dapper, there's Petapoco. These slides are available on robrich.org, and you're welcome to click through all the blue links to get to more .NET framework providers, or even more .NET framework providers, where they'll talk about .NET Core support and on and on, relational and non-relational, and yeah. So which one would I pick? Hold on, let me finish scrolling. Yeah, there are lots of database providers. Now what's interesting but annoying is I have exactly one DLL reference. So I want to use Petapoco. I don't want the overhead of loading the Entity Framework NuGet package, but all I have is Microsoft.asp.NET ASP.NET Core.all. And you're saying that's going to pull in everything. Yes and no. The term is called tree shaking. At the point where they do the compile, well actually the publish, they notice which NuGet packages, which portions of the .NET Framework, Entity Framework, ASP.NET Core, you're actually using, and it will only include those NuGet packages in the final bundle that they deliver, the final bin folder. So yes, I'm referencing ASP.NET Core all, but I'm not deploying ASP.NET Core all together with Entity Framework. I chose Petapoco. I'm going to get a much smaller DLL.
Is the shaking based on your using statements, or does it actually go into like what was being called?
Good call. Does it use my using statements, or does it use my code references? That I don't know. But they throw around the term static analysis, and static analysis is generally looking at code, not looking at using statements.
Rosalind enables all of these things.
Yes.
I have a full code tree of that all the time.
Rosalind is gorgeous. All hail the gods that created Rosalind. Writing a language compiler in the language is actually yet another wonderful thing. So what if I break the build, and now I no longer have a compiler to build my language? That's a lot of fun. So there's lots of storage options. If Entity Framework tickles your fancy, that's great. If not, then there are many more that are also supported on .NET Core.
For Entity Framework, I remember hearing Ward Bell say during the beta that he felt like the OneNetO beta at that time was writing SQL statements like he would write.
Yes.
I never heard if that truly ended up being that way in production. I didn't know if you had a take on it.
Yes, I've heard that too. Ward Bell's quote is great that says, Entity Framework creates SQL statements now. He would create SQL statements. I have seen that to be true. I haven't gotten close enough to are they the way I would write it too? But yeah, separating, previously when I would do .include, it would join the tables and return all the duplicate data in one spot. Now it does two separate queries, one for this one and one for that one. It will translate interesting link things into SQL, and it's not interjoining and nesting all the things. Entity Framework 6 creates some really gnarly SQL, and Entity Framework Core does not.
But it's still efficient, right?
It is. It's still efficient.
Is there anything else that, other than the EDMX stuff, is there anything else that's, not in the
Anything else inside Entity Framework Core that is not in the regular Entity Framework? Yeah. Anything in Entity Framework Core, anything in Entity Framework that isn't in Entity Framework Core, is that better? We don't have the designer, we don't have EDMX. As we were getting closer to it, we moved from this object context to a DB context, and all of Entity Framework Core is based on that DB context model. There is no object context. As we got more into Entity Framework 6 and Entity Framework 5, object context kind of fell away. It was embedded inside of our object, but we never dealt with it that way. So probably, if we've been keeping track of our code, we're all using DB context now anyway, so it's not really that traumatic. Table per type and table per hierarchy are supported in Entity Framework Core, and so those are some of the wacky places where I need to reach into the advanced things, and those are there. In Entity Framework Core, but not in full Entity Framework, it will retry on cloud attempt failures, which is kind of nice. And so there isn't a lot that I've gone looking for in Entity Framework Core that I used to use in full Entity Framework that I haven't been able to find. But I also reach into this list a lot too.
Even without the EDMX, is it still possible to do like a database first style of database management, or is code first kind of the direction?
Good call. It's code first, but does that mean that I must create the code first and use that to generate the database, or can I create the database and use it to generate code?
I always said code first was a bad name for it.
Yes. And they've kind of dropped the code first name. I use it here because it's the name we're familiar with. But they're talking about entity-based development. So yes, I build my database inside Visual Studio, and then I'll come into the code to make corresponding classes. There is a tool called Entity Framework Reverse Engineering, I think, something like that. Yes, which I think is also a horrid name that does that as well. Ultimately, how do I validate that they're the same? I actually have unit tests that will go reflect on my classes and go use SQL SMO to go read the tables in my database and go validate that they're the same. Because ultimately, one is not a superset of the other. In my database, I have indexes, and I have statistics, and I have key lengths, and I have those types of things. In my model, I have validation rules, and I have regular expressions, and I have interesting data types, like this one will allow HTML, and this one must be an email address. So I can't necessarily just say, one of those places contains all the information. So that's when it's like, well, can we create a third place that does contain all the information? Yeah, that's the EDMX file. That didn't work well. Yes, it was quite redundant. Quite repetitive as well.
But basically, what I've read is you can still do code first or database first.
Yes. You can do code first, second.
Right.
Yeah.
Jump between the two, keep doing one and then the other. And then
Yep, exactly. I'll have Visual Studio open, I'll have SQL Management Studio open, and I'll be, back and forth. The Visual Studio tools for designing tables has actually gotten much better as well, which is really cool. Not specific to .NET Core, but that's a play on Visual Studio 2017.
Just to recap on what we just said, so if we have an existing Oracle database or SQL database or whatever, there isn't going to be a tool in the .NET Core stack that will turn those into objects, but there are other libraries out there, like Hibernate, that probably something.
Yes, I will be hard pressed to find a really great tool that will reach into my Oracle database and produce classes. I can find some that will get me started, but they won't do a great job. If you want a tool that'll do a great job, go talk to him.
It's possible, but it'll take a little bit of work. You have to know a great deal about the database provider and what it gives you. But once you get past that, basically you go out to the database and say, hey, tell me about yourself, and then you interpret the information as it comes in.
Yeah, once you get your PhD, calculus is pretty easy.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, he did an awesome job digging way deep into that. It was fun. So all this is sunshine and roses. What's the bad news? Oh, it is so totally done yet. .NET 1.0 was not done yet. You know, that's when you take it out of the oven and you go, are cupcakes supposed to be runny? They put it back in the oven. They got .NET 1.1 or .NET Core 1.1, and that was pretty good. .NET 2.0 is definitely the place that we want to go. Not ported. Web forms, SignalR, GDI. Do you have that spot on your website where you upload the user's profile picture, and then behind the scenes you're going to resize it so that you're not like serving that 5 meg image on every request? Yeah, that isn't here. There are many community replacements that will do this. Monos is a great solution as well. But you know, ultimately, GDI plus system.drawing is not in .NET Core, not even in .NET Core 2.0. You know that library that was written by that one guy that you know, we let him go like 4 years ago, and none of us can figure out how it works, and every time we go open the code, we break like 7 other things, so we don't render that, we don't build that anymore. Yeah, that wasn't ported to .NET Core either, sorry. So is this a deal breaker? It is not. Welcome to type forwarding. This is magic. This is so cool. So in the full .NET framework, I depend on MS Core lib. And in .NET Core, I depend on system.standard, I think, system.something, to be able to get those base types. So how do I do this? I have my .NET framework code, and I want to be able to consume it from my .NET Core code. This is also part of that big lie. So my .NET standard-based class library that depends on .NET Standard consumes a .NET Framework library that depends on the regular framework. Based on type forwarding, I know my application knows that it's running on the .NET Core. And so at runtime, it goes, hey, you want some core lib types? I can do that. And so it does this automatic shim to get framework assemblies into .NET Core assemblies. Provided that all the types within my .NET Framework DLL are compatible .NET Standard types, I can use that DLL that was built from .NET Core today.
Assuming that full framework is installed on that machine?
Yes. And here's that problem is exactly that. This depends on Windows, because this full framework DLL is a Windows DLL. So I can't now take my Windows library that I wrote 10 years ago and run it on Linux. I can run it on Windows just fine on .NET Core, but I can't run it on Linux or Mac. I still require that Windows to do it. But I get this automatic kind of shim between .NET Framework and .NET Core. So now I can use .NET Framework to depend on .NET Core libraries, and .NET Core to depend on .NET Framework libraries, to a point. Ultimately, this isn't great, but this is a great way to get past that one thing that is preventing you from moving off of .NET Framework onto .NET Core. So, should I move? Can I move? I like to ask these questions. Do I need cross-platform or nano server? Are my dependencies ported? Am I OK with the page edge? Do I want to go fast? .NET Core is substantially faster than .NET Framework. And so this kind of helps you understand, is it time to move to .NET Core? Should I port to .NET Core? I would argue that greenfield projects probably do make sense in .NET Core. Maintenance projects, projects that I built last year, 5 years ago, probably will stay on .NET Framework. That thing that I built a week ago or a month ago, do I want to flip it over to .NET Core? Maybe. Maybe not. If I wrote it 3 months ago or 6 months ago, probably not. Maybe so. That might be a cool adventure to see, can I move my thing to .NET Core?
Have you done anything?
I have. Thus, flat forehead. So how do I do it? Can I move to .NET Core? I love these two sites. Of course, Microsoft names things awesome. It's the Visual Studio Portability Analyzer with the name that's this long. It's this Visual Studio extension that I pointed at my .NET Framework project, and it goes, oh, by the way, here's the things that'll work, and here's the ones that don't. The one that I like better, iCan-has.net. iCan-has.net is awesome. The people at Octopus Deploy built iCan-has.net. I upload my packages.config or my project.json or my packet.dependencies or my csproj file, and it will list the dependencies in my project. I'm not uploading my source code. I am only uploading my project references. Based on the project references, it will break the answer into 3 lists. Here's the first list. They're definitely on .NET Core. It's great. Here's the next list. There are .NET Core versions of it, but you need to upgrade to do interesting things. Maybe mine is called My Framework, and the other one is called myframework.core. So I'll need to switch the name of the NuGet package. And then the third list is nope. So I started with that nope list, and I just started Googling things. And about half or 2/3 of them, yeah, I could either find .NET Core versions of them, or I could find suitable alternatives to them. So nothing was really a deal breaker once I ran it through here. That's a good way to say, is it time? This can help you with that. Any questions so far? So iCan-has.net. The only thing missing from this is a picture of a cat. It definitely needs a picture of a cat. So the gotchas in moving to .NET Core. Why are there less overloads? In the full .NET framework, there's all these overloads that have different versions. The goal of .NET Core originally was to be a small, compact subset. So some of those overloads went away. .NET Framework brought back a lot of them, a lot of types as well. But you may find that you may need to modify your code a little bit. Now, what's cool about that is once you modify it, you can take that back into the full framework and it'll work just fine too. It just has less shiny bits. Which NuGet package do I need to load to get that thing? This is a really cool discovery page, package.search.azurewebsites.net. I put in my class name, and it tells me the NuGet package it's in, which was really necessary right up until .NET Framework, .NET Core 2. Now, because I'm including that Microsoft.ASP.NET package, I got them all. I don't need to go searching for them anymore, which is wonderful. What else should I worry about? This is a .NET Rocks episode, 1335, where they dig into all kinds of details about migrating from .NET Framework to .NET Core. And yeah, it can get really deep. That's an hour, but it's definitely an hour well spent. What do they say? Well, they talk about this, and they talk about this, and they no, I'm just kidding. Any questions?
So with the app that you were creating with the .NET Core, would you be able to push that and publish it Azure Cloud right now? Azure services up there work?
Yes, good question. We created a website. Can I publish this to Azure right now? Yes, I can. Azure will fully support .NET Core 2.0 right now. So yeah, I just right-click publish and do all the things. If you came to my talk last night, don't right-click publish. I love the quote by Damian Brady. He says, friends don't let friends right-click publish. But yeah, run it through your normal CI process, validate your site with all of your websites, and the final step in that build is, yeah, definitely deploy it to Azure. It'll work just fine.
Do you get to deploy to IIS production server on base?
Good call. What do I need to do to deploy it to IIS? Ultimately, I get that publish content in the same way that I did a publish in full .NET Framework. And that publish package, I point IIS to it. I install the .NET Core SDK on my IIS. But actually, I don't believe I need the SDK. I need the .NET CLI on my IIS box, and that lights up all of the features within IIS to say, oh, by the way, this is a .NET Core thing, and away you go.
That the same for your build server, or that would need this SDK and the CLI?
The build server does need the SDK because it's doing build stuff. And so, as we get into Docker packages, it's exactly that way too. This Docker package just has the .NET Framework, and this one has the .NET Framework and the SDK, and which one do I need? The SDK, sorry, we're borrowing Java terms. Software Development Kit, those are the build tools. So if we're going to build, we need those. If we just want the runtime, then we only need the .NET CLI, and everything else comes with that. %80 sure that I'm right there. And if not, I'm going to have a really interesting blog post tomorrow. The cool part, though, is the publish to Azure process is smooth as butter. You just kind of say, here you go, and it goes, OK. Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for letting me play.